Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit. You know, the one that takes on those academic papers so you don't have to. And today, we're really diving into this whole idea of mindful consumption. I feel like it's everywhere these days, right? But does anyone actually know what it means?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those buzzwords, isn't it? Like, we're all supposed to buy less and care more, but how do you actually do that?
Exactly. And that's where this paper comes in, right? Mindful consumption. Its conception, measurement, and implications. From the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science. Sounds intense.
It's a good one. Really gets into the nitty-gritty of what mindful consumption actually is, IS, not just what people think it is. Plus, they figured out how to measure it, which is huge.
Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. What were the researchers hoping to find out with this paper? What was the big question driving this whole thing?
Well, they basically wanted to develop a clear definition of mindful consumption that everyone could agree on. Because if you look at the research out there, it's all over the place, right?
So no one really knew what they were even talking about half the time.
Pretty much. So that was their first goal. Then they wanted to create a reliable way to actually measure it. Because if you can't measure it, how can you study it, right?
Makes sense. But they didn't just want to be stuck in the theoretical weeds, did they? How did they bring this idea of mindful consumption down to earth?
This is what I love about this paper. They didn't just stay in the ivory tower. They went straight to the source. Everyday consumers.
Oh, interesting. So they actually talked to people about their shopping habits.
They did. They had these in-depth conversations with consumers to see how people think about mindful consumption in their daily lives. What does it mean to them? What are their struggles? It's this mix of academic research and real-world insights that makes this paper so valuable.
Okay, so they were trying to bridge that gap between what the research says and what's actually happening out in the real world. Love that. So tell me, what did they learn from those consumer conversations? What did people say about mindful consumption?
Well, they found that people generally think of it as like being aware of the impact of their choices, caring about those impacts, and then actually doing something to change their behavior.
So it's not just about like feeling bad about buying something new, it's about taking action.
Exactly. And from those conversations, they identified 3 core dimensions of mindful consumption. They called it the ACT framework: awareness, caring, and temperance. Catchy, right?
I love a good acronym, the ACT of mindful consumption. I'm going to remember that. All right, break it down for me. What does each of those dimensions really mean? Let's start with awareness.
Okay, so awareness is all about understanding the impact of your consumption choices, like where your clothes come from, how are they made, what happens to them when you're done with them. They actually call this SSE, self, society, and environment.
Okay, so considering the impact on yourself, your community, and the planet. Got it. But awareness on its own doesn't necessarily change behavior, does it? That's where caring comes in.
You got it. Caring is about having a genuine concern for those impacts. It's one thing to know that fast fashion is bad for the environment, but it's another to actually feel motivated to do something about it.
So it's like letting that awareness sink in
Yeah.
and actually affect your choices.
Exactly. And that brings us to the T in ACT, temperance.
Right, temperance. That's the self-control part, right? Resisting those impulse buys. Like maybe thinking twice before you buy that 10th pair of shoes you don't really need.
You know it. It's about making intentional purchases that align with your values, rather than just getting swept up in the moment.
This ACT framework is making a lot of sense so far. It's like they took this big abstract idea of mindful consumption and broke it down into these 3 digestible pieces. But how do you go from a framework to a way to actually measure it? That seems tricky.
That's where the real work began. They started by coming up with a ton, and I mean a ton of potential survey questions, like over 391. They really wanted to capture all the nuances of mindful consumption.
Wow, 391 questions. That's a lot to sift through. How did they even begin to narrow that down?
Well, they got a team of academic experts together to review every single question. They wanted to make sure each one was clear, relevant, and really captured the essence of those ACT dimensions.
So a rigorous screening process, no stone unturned. But even after that, 391 is still way too many questions for a survey, right? What do they do next?
Okay, so after the experts weighed in, they were down to a slightly more manageable 95 questions. Still a lot, but progress. Then they took those 95 questions straight to the streets, or at least to a group of everyday consumers like you and me. They wanted to see how these questions landed with the people they were actually trying to understand.
Smart move, getting feedback from real people. So they weren't just stuck in their academic bubble.
Not at all. They wanted to make sure these questions resonated with people's actual experiences. And the consumers they talked to, they really dug deep. They looked at the questions, tossed out any that just weren't working, and then ranked the rest. How well did they really capture that awareness, caring, or temperance vibe? And get this, after all that, they were down to just 11 questions.
Wow, from 391 to 11. Talk about a serious edit. Okay, so they had these 11 golden questions. What did they do with them?
Time to put them to the test, right? I mean, they had to make sure these questions actually worked together as a real legitimate scale. They did a whole bunch of studies, got kind of technical, but it's fascinating stuff.
All right, you've piqued my curiosity. Walk me through it.
So first, they did a smaller study, like a test run, with around 300 people. They wanted to see how those 11 questions, hung together. Like, did the awareness questions actually measure awareness and not, say, temperance by mistake?
Right, because if they weren't measuring the right thing, the whole scale would be totally useless.
Exactly. But good news, everything checked out. Each group of questions was right on target, measuring exactly what it was supposed to. But of course, they didn't stop there. They wanted to make sure this thing was rock solid. So they went big for the main study.
Let me guess, we're talking a much bigger group of people this time.
Oh yeah, way bigger. Over 1,800 people. And they weren't just picking randomly either. They made sure to include people from all walks of life, different backgrounds, genders, ages, income levels, the whole shebang.
So basically making sure that this whole mindful consumption thing wasn't just for one specific type of person.
Precisely. They wanted their scale to be relevant and accurate for everyone.
Makes sense. So after all that work, all those participants, what happened? Did their mindful consumption scale pass the test?
It did, with flying colors. Remember those 3 dimensions, awareness, caring, temperance? They came through loud and clear no matter how they looked at the data. By gender, age, you name it, those ACT dimensions were rock solid.
Wow, that's impressive. So they basically proved that this ACT framework wasn't just some random idea they came up with. It's a real reliable way to understand how people think about mindful consumption, no matter who they are or where they come from.
Exactly. But remember how we were talking about how predicting behavior is the holy grail of this kind of research?
Yeah, it's one thing to measure something, but if it can actually tell you how someone's going to act, that's next level.
Right. So they wanted to see if their scale could actually predict what people buy.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. How'd they do that? Did they, follow people around the mall, secretly judging their shopping cart?
No mall stakeouts, thankfully. Instead, they started by thinking about the kinds of products people tend to buy, less mindfully. The impulse buys, the trendy stuff that catches your eye, but maybe you don't really need.
Oh, I know those all too well. The siren call of the sale rack gets me every time.
To figure out what those danger zone products were, they actually asked a group of college students to name things they wouldn't buy mindfully, in different situations. And they came up with the top 10 list of the least mindfully purchased items.
Sneaky. So they were like, tell us about your worst shopping impulses.
Yeah.
I like it. So what topped the list? What are the things we're buying without thinking?
Well, the top 3 were pretty interesting and probably relatable for a lot of people. Mobile phones, clothing, and cosmetics.
Yeah, that tracks. It's all about keeping up with the latest and greatest, right?
Yeah.
Maybe showing off a little. Not exactly the cornerstones of mindful consumption.
Right. So they took those 3 product categories, mobile phones, clothes, cosmetics, and they looked at whether people who scored high on their mindful consumption scale were less likely to have recently bought those things.
Okay, drum roll please. Did it work? Did their fancy scale actually predict what people bought?
Wow. It did. It really did. They found that people who scored higher on the mindful consumption scale, the ones who are more aware, caring, and have that good self-control, they were way less likely to have bought a new phone, clothes, or makeup recently.
No way. That's amazing. So their scale actually predicted their behavior, they called it. That's huge. So what can we actually do with all this? It's one thing to measure mindful consumption, but how do we use this knowledge?
This is where it gets really exciting. Think about it. This research gives companies a whole new way to understand and reach mindful consumers. Like, imagine designing products with mindfulness baked in from the very beginning.
Instead of just slapping an eco-friendly label on something and hoping for the best?
Exactly. We're talking about using recycled materials, cutting down on packaging, offering repair services, even designing products that are meant to last. It's a whole different way of thinking about business.
That makes a lot of sense. And with this new scale, companies could actually measure how well their products resonate with mindful consumers. They could actually see what works.
Absolutely. And it's not just about products either. This research can change how companies market themselves. They can target their message to the people who are already on board with mindful consumption. Less trying to convince everyone and more connecting with those who already care.
It's like they're speaking directly to their values, not just their wallets. I love that. This feels like a win-win for businesses and ED consumers.
It really is. And it's a good reminder that we as consumers, we have power. We can choose to support the businesses that are doing things the right way.
So well said. Our choices really do matter. This has been such an insightful conversation. Huge thanks to Sharad Gupta and Gupta Sheth for this incredible research. Their paper, Mindful Consumption, its conception, measurement, and implications really is a game changer. All right, everyone, that's a wrap on this deep dive into mindful consumption. Until next time, happy revising.